start for one reason. This talk barely fits into 45 minutes. It's really much better as an hour talk. I'm Gregg Marshall. I've been on Drupal.org for about 10 years. Went to my first DrupalCon in 2010, sort of had the epiphany that I should become a Drupal developer at that point instead of just a site user, builder sort of person. Currently, I'm a Drupal architect for Accenture Digital, and I'm if you care, an Acquia Grandmaster, which means I take tests very well. And I'm going to be assisted by my able assistant Jackson, which is a joke from the book. And I'll pretty much try to keep the book references down to a minimum. I guess, yeah, the other thing is I wrote a book, if you didn't notice the titles. Yeah?
Could you do us hard of hearing folks a huge favor, project the absolute best?
Okay, I'll do my best.
I'm sorry to ask that.
No, not a problem. The other thing is, this is not church. There are seats up front.
Yeah.
You may find that works better. Anyways, okay. So, and the usual disclaimer, because I now work for a very large company that I've never worked for a large company. Basically, I'm here as me, not as Accenture, so anything I say, don't hold against them. And so let's start off with what is views. How many of you are like site builders, don't have any clue what's going on? Okay, good. Views, when you hear it in the plural, is the views module. And before Drupal 8, that was a contributed module. As of Drupal 8, it's part of core. And basically, the way to think of views is it lets you build dynamic lists. And those lists can be formatted in a number of ways. The other way I like to view it, because I'm old, is it's the crystal reports of Drupal. And the only people who laughed are the people who've been around long enough to understand that Crystal Reports was a report writer that was available for Microsoft and DBase and things like that back in the days of operating systems that didn't have GUIs. And then you talk about the view in the singular, and that's a single definition of a list. So you have views in the plural, which is the module, view in the singular, which is a list. And let's talk about why you would want to use views as opposed to other ways you could do content. And the best way to think about it is a lot of blogs have the 5 most recent blog posts. And if you did that manually, you would have a block on your Drupal site, and you would add a blog post through add content, and then you would go have to edit the block to fix the 5 most recent posts because you just created the most recent post. When you have views, you add the blog post, and the 5 most recent posts are updated. It's all automatic, and so you're able to go in and take this piece of information that you used one place and put it somewhere else. When it was Drupal 7, views was the #1 module. Now, technically, that's not true. CTools was the #1 module, but CTools is a dependency of views and several other modules, and so what it turns out is about 84% of all Drupal 7 websites have views installed on it. And in Drupal 8, most of the administration pages are now views. So if we look at one of them, like the front page, which used to be a piece of code that generated the same thing, it's very simply a view. The content list is a view now. The files view is a view, obviously. Who's online is a view. So these are all things that are built into Drupal that come out of the box that are actually views that are defined within the thing. Even the user list is now simply a view. So you have all these views that you can use. This is a slide that you just never know where to put. Do you put it at the beginning? You put it at the end? There are a couple of settings I really like to set for views. So if you go into the views page, there's this little sub-tab hiding in there saying settings. And a couple of them that I turn on all the time, and yes, they're screenshots and they're probably not readable. I'm just giving you a general location generally. You won't see a demo, and this is not training. If you think you could train in 45 minutes, try a day maybe, to really understand views and get the most out of it. But 2 things I always turn on is I always turn on the option that says always show the advanced column. because it's normally in views, it's a field set that's closed, and you see what looks like 3 columns. I'll show you a screen in a second. And most people don't realize there's this like last third of views that's available for you to configure. And so I like to just turn it on and always have it display, because 99.9% of the time I'm going to click that and open it up anyways. The other thing I like to do is, even though I'm not an SQL person, yes?
So where is that particular configuration page?
You go to your views list, and over on the right-hand side there should be a little button that says settings.
Okay.
And the other thing I do is, even though I'm not an SQL programmer normally, I like to turn on the SQL queries, because sometimes looking at them gives you a hint at what might be going wrong, especially when you get to a point where you're debugging relationships and contextual filters, which we'll talk about later. But it's handy to have that show up. The other thing that happens is, if you don't see an SQL query, it explains why you didn't get any results. So the first thing I like to do is let's start off with one of the existing views and just make a simple change. So my prototypical sample is a real estate agency, and I want to be able to let a real estate agent see the properties that they've listed, but none others, and be able to edit and do all the things you would normally do off the content list. So I need a slightly adapted version of the content list. And so if I look at the preview results, because I never bothered capturing a screen that had it saved, I'm just going to show the title, which is where we stuck the address of the property. I'm going to put the last updated. I took out a lot of things, and I've limited the operations that are available to edit and add, basically. And to do that, what I would do is go to the views listing page, and I would go over to the pull-down menu on the right and say duplicate. And the reason why I would do that is I would never really suggest that you edit one of Core's views, because if you make a mistake and you mess up the view, you've just messed up your ability to interact with Core. There are ways to get back to where you should be, but for the most part, always start by duplicating something. So I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to go into the edit screen. And this is the edit screen, and it's very tiny, and it just shows you there are 3 columns, because I've already set that setting that lets me see it all. But let's look at it in a little more detail. So over on the left-hand side, we have the kind of view it is. Up at the top, the displays, and we'll talk about those in a bit. The format, which fields I'm putting out if I'm using a field setting-based view, what my filter criteria are, and we'll come back to all this. I'm just giving you an idea of what's there. And sort criteria. You get to the middle, and you've got, if it's a block, the block settings. If it's a page, the menu settings, and whether access is there. You get a header, a footer, and a no results that you can do things with, either above, below, or if nothing is going to come back out. So in the case of a view that you put to on this real estate, if somebody selected properties through an exposed filter, and again, that's things we'll keep coming to, you could actually say, I'm sorry, but there are no properties that are 30,000 square feet and cost under $10,000, which could be theoretically something someone would select. And then you have the pager definition. And then finally, over on the right, you've got contextual filters and relationships, and then a number of really what I would call advanced settings. So the first 2 are less advanced, and the rest are things that you really sort of have to have some experience with views before you can dig into. So if I looked at the edit screen for the original content thing, what I would do is I would be changing some things, and I'm going to delete some others, and that's all I have to do to create my new view. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm changing the name to available properties. The red arrows I'm going to delete, so I would click on the field, it would open up the edit window, and down at the bottom there's this remove link that you see sort of buried in the middle. And at the bottom, I'm going to change the one filter to not be an exposed filter, but to actually be just for the logged in user. And once I've got that set up that way, so basically if I look at the before and after, you end up with a much simpler view. So you can adapt the view and really not understand too much about what views does and make it a useful new purpose. And you can then, I define this as a block, and then I display the block on the user page, filtered by the person that's there. So what really makes views powerful, if you only use views with the basic page and the article that's available in Drupal, it wouldn't be a really exciting tool. But what really makes it powerful is the concept of structured content. So the idea is that you, in Drupal 7, they added the fields, which used to be in, before Drupal 7, CCK. In Drupal 7, you had modules that did entity references. Those are now built into core in Drupal 8. And you have a number of field types. And so you can also extend that with contributed modules like the geolocation module, which gives you longitude and latitude and lets you actually geotag where a particular piece of content might be located. And so when you add those, you could actually build a very rich data structure. So, and again, this is not something you want to look in detail, but the idea is I have a property which is made up of a number of fields, the address, which I haven't put in the title because it works really well for Drupal. You've got the rest of the address fields that go with that. You've got the asking price, the number of bedrooms, all the things that a typical property listing would have in an MLS listing. And then you've got some entity references that are going over to other content types. And those content types, one of them is realtors, so I can have multiple realtors attached to a given property. I can also have multiple sellers attached to a given property. And each of those is defined pretty much the same way. They just have different names and they're different content types. And then finally, I added something called an open house, which is a different kind of field that references back to the property and allows me to define events called open houses. So if I look at the relationships of all this in a map, what I end up with is sort of property in the middle, and I've got open houses related back to properties, and then I've got properties related to the realtor, the other things. And down to the bottom, I've got some taxonomy terms, or they're a different kind of entity reference, but still an entity reference. One that defines the neighborhood in a taxonomy, and the other that defines the county in a taxonomy. And they very likely could, in some markets, be the same. Other places, you might have a county in one case and a different neighborhood in another. But the idea is you've got this related set of data, and I'm not duplicating the realtor's name in every single property that realtor's selling. It also makes it very easy if a realtor changes, I can just sort of substitute them. So coming back to views, now that we've got sort of structured data that makes views interesting, the components of a view, basically the pieces are you've got a base or view type, and when you first create a view, you pick it, and once you've picked it, views forgets to tell you what it is, so sort of remember. But basically, I would say 95% of the views you'll ever build are views of content, and that's a kind of view. Think of it as the outermost table that you're doing if you have any clue what a database is. And so what you do is you define, I want a view of content, and then I'm going to filter it. And so I can do that. Then within views, you have displays. So you have a page, or you have a block, or you have an RSS feed. And then you have formats within those. And then you have a display type, which is within that. And then finally, two things that you do are filters and sorts. And we're going through these in more detail. So when we create a new view, there's a wizard page that Drupal provides you that walks you through setting up most of it. And the one thing I'll warn you is it's an expanding form, which you'll find as you do more Drupal. So something looks, devilishly simple. You click a box, and all of a sudden there are 18 more forms there. So that happens. And you can create the most common 2 or 3 displays, but not all displays can be created through it. So there are times when you'll literally not select a display and create an empty view and then add a display, like if you wanted to have a RSS feed only, or if you wanted to use the REST API parts of views. So when you create a new view, you get a form that looks like this. You give it a name, and the name has to be unique. And then you give it the view settings is where you actually define what it is. And then, like I said, most of the time it'll be a view of content, but you can do views of users, you can do views of taxonomies, you could do views of custom defined tables if the table is properly defined in code so that views knows how to talk to it. And then you have some settings, and you'll check a box that says I want to create a page or I want to create a block, and those are display types. And then when you click save and edit, so when this is the expanding block thing. So what happens is when I say I want to create a page, it asks me some more questions, like do I want a pager? Do I want, what URL do I want to give it? Do I want to give it a menu? So be prepared for expanding blocks as you go through this. Once you've created a new view, so I'm going to fill it out in this particular way. So I'm going to do a page and a block. What it'll do is it'll take me to the edit screen where I can then come back and define. So my base views are, like I said, 95% of content. I always wondered what you could do with content revision. And I gave this in Minneapolis, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, we have legal requirements to show every single edit that's ever been made to a page to the public so that they know, because they do, I think it was law library or something, where literally the law, every edit to the law had to be updated and shown, and you could actually see it all. Comments now are entities, so you can actually do views of comments. So you could have a view that shows the most popular comment based on number of sub-comments coming off of it. You can do views of log entries, which is a interesting concept that probably isn't too practical, because one of the things they tell you when you deploy to production is turn off the DB log module because it's resource intensive, and that's a view of the DB log, so it wouldn't do you much good at that point. You can do views of files, taxonomy terms, users. You can actually do views of blocks within Drupal 8 because blocks are now entities just like nodes were before. And then any type that's added by any custom module. So I've written custom modules that use dedicated database tables, and you define this small interface file that tells views how to access it, and you can do a view of Goodreads books that have been pulled down off the Goodreads system. So once you've got your view, sort of the framework of your view put together, the next thing you do is you do displays. Every view has a master display, the third item on the list, and as soon as you create another display, in the normal circumstance, the master display disappears. But it's sort of the default. So you can set up a view with a master display and then create a block and then create a page and have those slightly adapted, but have all of the core of it set up when you created the master. The most common one is a page. The second most common is a block. Between those two view types, that's probably, for the average site builder, 95% of all the views you will ever build. But there are other kinds of things. There are things called attachments, which basically is one view that you display under another view. So as an example, I could have a list of properties, and underneath it I could have the list of open houses that go with that particular list of properties. And so it's pulling the data from one to the other, and they're being displayed together on the same page. Embed is something new in Drupal 8 and appears to signal that it's going to be, you're going to use that view in code somewhere. It doesn't actually have any other code attached to it, so it's just a type. So it's right now it's a way of documenting. I think the intent was they were going to limit you when you access by code to only embed types. There's an entity reference, which is a very powerful new thing that's in Drupal 8. So literally, when you create an entity reference, you get a autocomplete field that lets you pull these select entities. So if I have an entity reference of properties, I can start to type in an address. It'll give me addresses that match that in an autocomplete way, and I can select from that. if I wanted to do something more creative and limiting, I could actually create a view that generates the list and it becomes a select list, and you'll see this list of properties that I could select one from. So that's what an entity reference display is. A feed is an RSS feed going out. So if I'm a blog, I would create a feed for each blog, sub-blog, and make it available on the sub-blog's overview page. And that way, people with RSS feeds and RSS readers could do that. And then finally, we've got Drupal 8's new thing, which is the REST export. And so basically, you can take anything you can create a display of on a web page and create it as either JSON or XML formatted API. And if you're doing headless Drupal, this is the way you would control a headless display, along with the rest of the REST API. Once I've defined now what I'm doing a view of and how I'm going to display it or use this view, the next thing I have to figure out is what I'm going to display. And so the built-in, there are only 4 built-in types. There's the grid, which before Drupal 8 was a table, now is actually divs with CSS, so it actually functions reasonably well. But you can do a grid, so you can have like 2 across, 3 down. You can have HTML lists, just very simple, either ordered or unordered list. You can do an unformatted list, which basically says, take whatever I'm putting out and just throw it on the page one after another. I'll deal with it on my own with the CSS. You can actually have a table, which is a very powerful capability, has lots of feeds, and I'll show you in a minute. But you can actually, you create a table and you can create it so each column is click sortable. So the person's looking at this table of 20 items and they want to look at by the first column. It's sort of like having Excel built into your view. And then contributed modules are really powerful in this particular place. So to add an accordion display, things that where the title, you click on the title and it opens up the body underneath it, or slideshows, carousels, those things that all designers say never should happen and every site owner wants. You can do that literally in a view very quickly, and you can do maps. So the modules haven't all ported yet, but in Drupal 7, the Gmap module is very popular. You can literally put a Google map that is interactive and shows the data that you've put in with that geolocation field, which is one of the reasons why the geolocation field is so handy. So once we've gotten the format we've picked, now we have options. And so in this particular case, I put up the table because it's by far the absolute most complex. Most of them have very few options. But in this case, I can have, and no, you can't read it. It's too small. But I can have 8 columns that would be way too wide, and I can combine 2 or 3 columns to make them stack on top of each other. And so I've done things like where I'll have a start date and time and an end date and time, and I really only need the time from the second one, so I'll format the second time as a time. The first one is a date and time, and I'll put them together in the same column and have it show up as just simply a date and time with a date range on it that wasn't possible until 8.1, 8.2, when they extended the date field. Once you've done that, then depending on what kind of format you've picked, you add, typically, at least my preference is to always add fields. Some people like to do display of content and then use the display modes that's built into Drupal 8 to order that content. My argument against it is that puts part of your formatting in one part of your Drupal site and the other part of your format, the rest of your view here, and it separates the two. I'm very much a proponent of doing views of fields because then I have lots of flexibility. And I can reorder the fields and I can rewrite the fields, and we'll show you some more things there. So this is where you add the fields and you put them in the order that they're going to come out in, either horizontally, vertically, however they end up being formatted by whatever it is you're using. Every field has settings, and so if you click on the field name after you've added it, you can say, I want the label, I don't want the label, I want a colon, I don't want the colon. I want it to not show up at all. And why would you ever have something not show up? Why bother putting it in the first place? Well, the next one of the other ones is the thing called a field rewrite. And so literally I can go in and I can define like the URL and the name and all those things as fields, not display them, and then in the field right of the last field actually build like a link, a photograph that links to something. There's other ways to do that, but that's an example. I can literally do all sorts of manipulations. There's also a similar kind of rewrite if you don't give an answer back. So let's say you try to display an empty field and you don't want blank. You could substitute in the fixed text. But the other thing you can do is you can do if then else's that way. So you could have one field that says if this field, if the PDF is there, display the PDF. If the PDF isn't there in the next field, display the link back to the entity. Yeah?
Is it possible to insert field reformatters in there?
You can't, there's limits to it to a point, but then what I discovered by accident one day is that field rewrite field, because it used to be it was in the token format, little square brackets, for those of you that have ever used token in previous to Drupal 8, and now all of a sudden it looks like double curlies like Twig, and at first I thought, well, they're just being conventional and using the same convention everywhere, and then I tried something and that field is actually a full Twig template. So anything you can do inside a Twig template, you can do inside a field rewrite in views. And to prove that point to myself, I wrote 3 lines of Twig code that put up the first 10 letters or 20 letters of the alphabet as uppercase letters with separated by asterisks. Yeah.
Calculations.
Only as far as you could do it within Twig. So I'm not certain Twig has a lot of calculations there. There is a contributed module that lets you do calculations within views.
Okay.
Don't know whether it ported to Drupal 8 yet, but it's sort of like a sledgehammer. It's a little bit cumbersome to use because it lets you do calculations, as in the scientific kind of calculations. It's got enough functions to keep a physicist happy.
And that's a module?
That's a contributed module, calculated field, views calculated field or something like that. So anyways, that's just something that we discovered about field rewrites. And then, so now I've got a view of contents, and now I need to select it. Because if, let's say I'm a real estate agent and I'm doing this, and I've got 10,000 listings, I probably don't want to show all 10,000 of them, especially if 2/3 of them have already been sold and they're just sitting there. And so this is where you start to say, only when these conditions are met do I want to display something. 2 that views will add automatically from the wizard is the first assumption is that it's published. And second, if you do a view of content and you select a content type, it then says content type equals whatever content type you selected. But now you can start to say, listing date greater than 6 months ago. Only sold by this particular real estate agent. You can start to add a number of different ways of limiting down to what you're showing from that. Does that make sense? And then it's very odd, but Views has filters over in the left-hand side and then exposed filters in the right-hand side. And the easiest way to think of an exposed filter is it's one of the left-hand side filters that instead of saying a fixed equal value, I can put the equal value into the URL and specify how to use the view, how to filter the view based on a parameter in the URL. And then what becomes sort of powerful is Views has logic that you can put in that says if there is nothing in the URL, which if you're defining a block and you use an exposed filter, which is perfectly legal and used often, you start thinking, wait a minute, block doesn't have a URL. How are you ever going to get a value to it? There's this thing where if there is no URL, provide a default value, and that value can come from somewhere. It can be from the user, it can be from the node, There are a number of different things, and that can be extended. And that's one of the other areas that becomes very interesting. So you get these exposed filters. Oh, I'm sorry, exposed filters are if I define a filter, let's say property value, asking price, I can put in, I can say it has to be between this value and this value, expose it, and make it so that a site visitor comes in, they can enter in a value for a lower asking price and upper asking price. Basically, here's my budget. I only want to look at properties that fit that way. And that's what it does. I actually started off on the next thing, slides, dyslexia in slides. So anyways, contextual filters are the filters that come from the URL. So you have exposed filters, which let the site visitor come along, and then you have contextual filters, which actually take it from another part of Drupal. And you can configure it through the URL, and you get this what do you do if it's default? So I've actually talked ahead of my slides, a couple of slides. And then the very last thing on the left-hand side, which is sort of important, is the sort criteria. And so I've got a view of properties that's filtered. Maybe I want to put it out in a certain order. Probably the Drupal default of date last entered or date entered into the system is not too exciting to most people. So you could do it based on distance from a location. If you've got the geolocation module turned on, you could sort it by asking price. You could sort it by number of bedrooms. There are any one of those or group of those. So you actually can define it. And for instance, if you're doing a date sort, you can select how granular you want that to be. So almost all the sort criteria are also configurable. And so I can say I only want to sort it to the nearest day, I want to sort it to the nearest second, or something in between. In addition, you can have multiple sort criteria. So you might say, I only want to sort it by the nearest day, and then I want it alphabetical by real estate agent beyond that. And you can stack sorts up into a larger stack. Okay, so now we've sort of defined the basic concepts, and we did one of the two advanced columns that are so popular. Let's go back and pick up the last advanced one that everybody uses eventually, and especially in Drupal 8. Drupal 8 has term references, which are entity references. You've got block references, which are entity references. In my case, I have properties that refer to real estate agents and things like that. I'd like to be able to use the information in that thing that's being related to. Now, views by default gives you the reference and nothing more. And that's an integer number. So it's the term ID, it's the node ID, it's the entity ID, it's an ID, and it's just a number. And so that's not really too useful if I'm referencing, let's say, a taxonomy term. I'd really like to use the term name. So I don't really want to say you live in County 13 and hope that you understand County 13 is your county. I want to be able to say you live in Jefferson County. And so in order to do that, I need to get to the term ID. In order to get to the term ID, I need to add a relationship that uses that ID, that entity reference field, to go over to the other thing. And now I've got a whole new set of fields that I can add to my view. And so literally I can go through and add a relationship. And it's very interesting because Views is a report writer, so it's a database query language of sorts. And there really is a good way to go and a bad way to go, and Views lets you go either way. So even though I have properties referring to realtors and sellers, I could do a view of realtors and get back to the property, even though that's a backward link. And the bad part of that is the performance goes down because it has to actually read the whole database table and figure out which ones are pointing at me instead of being able to just follow the link through the database. So it does it, and it makes it very flexible. But if you have a view that all of a sudden starts running really slow when you've added a relationship, you might look and see whether you got the relationship pointed the right direction. Sometimes you have to go back and start over and build the view from the thing that points to things rather than from the thing being pointed to. And once you've defined a relationship, then any field, and this is a quirk, I guess I would call it, of views, because it's very consistent and seems to be intentional, is that I can define a relationship to a taxonomy term like county name, and I can put the county name field in my view and still not see it. It's not until I actually go into the field definition and say, use the relationship, that it actually does it. And I think they do it mostly because that way it's always consistent. You know that if you don't do that, you'll always get the answer. And there are times when it's pretty clear what you wanted, but rather than fight that, they just let you actually select it. And it's possible to define relationships in such a way that there could be two different ways to get to a particular piece of data. And so that's one of the reasons why they do that. And so in the case of mine, if you notice, I have two titles, one of which is the address, and that happens to be the property title, and the other is the realtor, which happens to be the realtor's name I use as the title within that property, that content type. And so I've got two completely different fields that are being generated with the same basic name, because that's one thing you can't change in Drupal. And then finally, you've got some other view settings, and those are the things down the center column. You can put it in a menu if it's a page. So you can say automatically stick it in my main menu, or stick it in the navigation menu, or whatever you want to do. You can actually define permissions, so you can say only certain kinds of users on my site can actually see the results of this view. You can define, again, the header, the footer, and the no results page. So if I had exposed filters and I let people say I want 10,000 square feet for $2,000, it's probably a good idea to say there are no properties that meet your criteria, try again.
So at least they get some user feedback.
They get some user feedback that doesn't look like a broken page. So very handy to do especially if you put exposed filters in. Very frequently, if you don't have any exposed filters, you control it enough that may not be necessary. But then the header and footer is just a blob of text or something, because there's some pretty powerful functions in it at the top and a blob of text at the bottom, like you might have the standard MLS disclaimer text that you want to put on every listing that says, this is subject to change and we don't guarantee this property is actually available, and all that kind of stuff. And then finally, the pager. So you can create a view that will display 500 items 10 at a time as the default, and Drupal will automatically generate for you or views will automatically generate for you the go forward a page, go back a page, go to the beginning page, go to the ending page, go to some arbitrary page. So that pager is configurable, and one of the things you can do is with a contributed module called Views Infinite Scroll is you can say, I want pictures in a grid, and I'm going to put up 2 by 4, and then use the Views Infinite Scroll. So as I scroll down, it just keeps adding them, sort of Facebook style, and just keeps going forever. So it looks like you put it all up, even though you only put up 4 at a time. So those are things you can do. Any other questions? So I sort of screamed through it and actually ended up 4 minutes in advance, which is probably because I talk really fast. Yeah?
I thought it was wonderful, first of all, and thank you. The one thing since we have a minute, if you wouldn't mind explaining the contextual filters real quickly one more time. You went over that one a little faster.
Okay. So you understand what a filter is?
I understand.
Okay. So he wants me to explain what a contextual filter is one more time. And I did go over it very quickly. And I did it out of sequence because I had the wrong slide up.
I think that's
and so that probably confused you even more.
Right.
But so if you understand what a filter is, and that's my working assumption is I'm not going to explain a filter. The way to think of a contextual filter is it's very simply a filter that gets the thing I'm testing against from the URL in the simplest case. So let's say I have a filter that says I want all properties greater than 2,000. Well, actually, there's one I used it as an example because anyone ever seen Tiny House Nation? It's this interesting TV show on TWI or something. Anyway, some bizarre thing about people who build and design, build, and live in houses under 500 square feet. And it's always, the most impressive ones are where they come out of like 5,000 square feet and they learn how to live in 300. And so I thought, well, it'd be fun to have a tiny house filter. So I could have tiny house less than 500 feet. Let's say I wanted to be a little more flexible than that. I could literally say tiny house less, I could create a contextual filter that says square footage less than and not define a number, and then pass to it in the URL how many square feet I want it to be. So if it's a tiny house, it's 500. Let's say a small house is 1,000, and then a big house is more than 500. You need a different filter for that. But you can literally pass it through the URL. And then more advanced, within views, there's settings that let you say, what happens if I don't have a URL or I don't have the value in the URL? Can I create a default value? Like I might have 500 as my default value. So if I just go to that page without anything, I get that. It might also be, let's say I want to do a view by user. I could pass the user in that way, but I could also say, if the person's logged in, and I don't pass it, let's just take the user number of the logged in user and give them that. So that's what a contextual filter does, is it lets you use information. And I've always sort of felt like contextual filters really should be a checkbox on filters, much like exposed filters are, because there's some things you can do down in the filter section in terms of ands and ors and mixtures of filters that you can't do with contextual filters. You can test for them, and they're either true or false, and they make the answer, but you can't make them part of bigger things. Yeah?
I feel like I'm always getting my relationships inside out and backwards and upside down. Is there any way outside of views to sort of get the relationship?
The best way to think of it is you want to do entity references go from one entity to another entity. So if I'm a property and I have taxonomy terms or realtors, I'm going from the property to the term. So if I always start my view at the thing that has the most froms and define my entities that way, that'll give you the proper direction. The best way I've found to do it within the selection, because you get both directions given to you as an option when you define a relationship, is, first of all, if you pick the wrong one, the preview will show you nothing because it's not there. If you pick the right one, then you pick the right one. And if you use that, I'm going from the inside to the outside approach, it's always the first one. And I forget the exact wording, but the exact wording is something like refers to. And what you don't want is referred to or referred by, because that's the one. And one of the reasons why I structured the particular data map that I showed you is so that I could actually have open houses backwards, which makes entering them and editing them very easy, but makes creating views of them very hard, because you either have to start at open houses and then do a relationship to bring in the property, or you start with the property and just assume you're going to take the performance hit to go back to the open house. So views will do it automatically. I think Drupal 6, you used to have like three extra modules to get that functionality. So it's nice that it's there and it's sort of built in. Does that make sense? After a while you get used to saying, okay, this is the this is the thing that points to everything else, so I do my view of it, and then I create my relationships from
My question
that.
was more, is there any way to set it up before you actually get to build it?
No, because views will let you do it either way, and it's when you do the wizard, you need to pick the most outer thing. Other questions, comments, snide remarks? Well, thank you for coming, and
What does the maximum rows per page? Is there a maximum?
no, because you can set the rows per page to 0, and it will display everything. And if that's 300,000 rows, you'll get 300,000 rows, or a white screen of death, whichever comes first. If you time out, PHP timeout. But no, to my knowledge, there is no maximum number. And I don't ever think I've actually looked at the code to see what size field they're putting that in. So there might be a number like 32,000 or 3 billion. Those are the two most common numbers that are limits. So, yeah.
Can you use views to query an outside SQL database?
Yes, no, and maybe. The answer is inherent views, no. As I mentioned at one point, there's a way within a module that defines a database to put a small file in there called views.inc that sets up a table in the Drupal way of doing everything as an array that defines the fields within that table, and then you can access it as if it were native to Drupal. But you have to do, at that point, a view of that particular newly defined, so it wouldn't be a view of content. A module I did for Columbus Metropolitan Library interfaces to Goodreads. And so we bring the data down of their bookshelf into a table. And we do it into a table so that we don't have the overhead of nodes, because nodes and fields are about an order of magnitude slower. And so we define that table back to views. So you do a view of Goodreads books. That's pretty easy to do. To do something else that references Goodreads books, you can do it with a relationship, but I can't remember, one of the connectors doesn't automatically generate. So it is possible to do it that way. And you can, because Drupal can access multiple different databases if you set up, you're starting to get really down a rabbit hole, but you can actually set up secondary databases within Drupal that they don't, it's so rarely used, I don't think I know how to do it, but I know it's there. And so you could have like MySQL running your Drupal site and a Progress SQL database sitting out there that's got some data that you pull in. And you can make that all happen with this little bit of custom code plus setting up the database table right in the settings.php file. And with that, we got to go.